Hi everybody, so this video is about experiments, okay? Now experiments is part of theory and methods, or methods in particular, especially methods. Now it will appear, theory and methods that is, appears on paper 1 and paper 3. Okay, so remember, theory and methods appear on paper 1 and paper 3. So now let's go through experiments as a method. So remember, please be very thorough with your notes. You have the added advantage that you can pause and rewind, but please make sure you're being very thorough when you are recording information. So experiments, let's look at them. So first of all, some introductory information about experiments for you. So there are two main types of experiments used within sociology. So you have, first of all, laboratory experiments, and you also have field experiments. Okay, so you have laboratory experiments and you have field experiments. Now, what about using experiments within sociology? Okay, so experiments are very commonly used in natural sciences, so kind of like your biology, your chemistry, and your physics, but they are very, very infrequently used in sociology. So we rarely use them, okay? Within sociology, they are not commonplace at all. Now, let's look at why. So, first of all, whenever we are studying human behavior, human behavior is really quite complicated, it's quite complex. Okay. And if humans know that they are being experimented on, it's likely to alter how natural their behavior becomes. So, as soon as we know we're being experimented on, our behavior may become less natural. Thus, the Hawthorne effect kicks in. And obviously, we know the Hawthorne effect can impact things like validity. So let's look at positivists. Now, obviously, we know positivists are a theoretical perspective. Remember that key term? So positivists are a theoretical perspective. So positivists are very in favour of researching under something called controlled conditions. Now, this is a really key term, okay? Controlled conditions. Let's look at this. So what does it mean? So, a controlled condition is when a person being studied or a group being studied is not given any particular kind of treatment. I'm using that word treatment here. In an experimental condition, they are given treatment. Now, I've got an example here to make it a little bit easier for you if you've not heard of these terms before. So, for example, I may compare how feeling cold affects people's ability to be sociable. So, that might be what I'm experimenting. So, how feeling cold affects people's ability to be sociable. So, my controlled condition group, so say I was researching 3 people, they would not have their temperature altered. Okay? But the experimental condition would, and that allows me to then compare how it might impact sociability. Okay, so however, there's a really key point here. Even though positivists like to research under controlled conditions, even they are very unlikely to use experiments because of significant ethical concerns that experiments bring to the fore. Okay, so even positivists do not like experiments. So what kind of data is produced? Generally, quantitative data comes from experiments, generally, hence the preference held by positivists. Because remember, theoretically speaking, positivists are very much in favour of quantitative data for a variety of reasons that we've looked at in previous videos. So what do interpretivists think? So all human beings are conscious actors, okay? So we know we're being researched if we were a part of an experiment, okay? So remember the Hawthorne effect. So if we know that we're part of an experiment, obviously we know we're being researched, so which can trigger the Hawthorne effect. Thus, interpretivists argue it's impossible to observe natural behaviour when people are partaking in an experiment. And natural behaviour is critical. It is so important to preserve the validity of your research. So could we not improve this by doing covert experiments? Remember, covert means when your target population do not know that they are being researched. Okay? when your subjects do not know that they are being researched, when your participants do not know that they are being researched. So can we not improve this issue raised here by doing covert experiments? Well, covert experiments violate significant ethical standards imposed by the BSA. Remember, we've looked at this in the previous video, the British Sociological Association, and they stipulate that research must follow particular ethical guidelines. So one of the main ethical concerns is if you were to do covert experiments, you've not gained informed consent from your target population or your subjects or your participants. Thus, covert experiments have a significant ethical concern, and remember, informed consent is vital, according to the British Sociological Association. Okay, now, obviously the background's changed, so we're going to start looking at laboratory experiments in depth to begin with. So when are they used in sociology? Okay, under very particular circumstances. Only in very specific circumstances are laboratory experiments used. Now, Popper is a key sociologist, okay? He's a key sociologist. And he argued in sociology, whenever experiments are used, they should take what's known as a deductive approach. Okay, so experiments should take what is known as a deductive approach. Now let's look at what a deductive approach is here. So, as a sociologist, I might have a theory or a belief. Okay, so I might have a particular theory about something or a belief about something. Now, I can then test that theory out in an experiment. So the experiment would then give me knowledge. Either A, it confirms that theory that I had, or the belief that I had, or B, it disproves the theory or the belief that I had. Either way, knowledge is gained. Thus, in effect, what the deductive approach is about is that you're testing a hypothesis during an experiment, okay? Now let's look at two really key terms, the independent and the dependent variable. And I will give you examples to kind of help you understand this. So independent variables may influence dependent variables, okay? So independent variables may influence dependent variables. So the independent variable in an experiment is altered to see how it affects the dependent variable. So the independent variable is altered to see how it affects the dependent variable. So let's look at an example. So the independent variable might be the number of calories that someone consumes. So we can either increase them or we can reduce them. Okay, so that's the independent variable. The dependent variable would be someone's weight. It might go up or down depending on how much the independent variable is altered. Okay, so cause and effect. So the independent variable is the cause, so calories would be the cause of weight going up or down, and the dependent variable is the effect. Don't forget that, please. Okay, let's continue to look at laboratory experiments. So variables in sociological research, okay, because obviously we're talking about sociology. So if we wanted to observe how actors' lives are affected, we could alter the following independent variables. These are examples, okay? So we could alter someone's income. So we could measure whether altering it would lead to economic deprivation. We could alter someone's popularity to test whether it might lead to anomie, psychic deprivation, etc. Okay, so these would be independent variables that we're altering. So what's the issue with this kind of research? So it is highly unethical to do so because remember the British Sociological Association argues we should do no harm in research. We've looked at that in a previous video. It's also highly impractical to do this kind of research because such research is likely to be very practically disadvantageous because it might take a lot of time and money to do it. If I wanted to test how altering someone's income is going to lead to economic deprivation, I'd have to study them for a very long period of time. That would take lots of time and money, and that kind of research is longitudinal, remember, and longitudinal research needs very sustained funding to conduct. So let's now look at a case study of a lab experiment. So Bandura. So what did he investigate? So he investigated the effects of watching media violence on children's behaviour. So he investigated the effects of how media violence can impact children's behaviour. So how did he conduct the experiment? So all children were shown a video of, so it's conducted in steps. So let's look at step A first of all, okay? So step A first of all. So all children are shown a video of a man hitting a Bobo doll. That's a kind of doll that you kind of hit and then it goes back upright, okay? Now, the children, step B, were then divided into separate rooms. Now, each different room had a different kind of independent variable in it. So in room 1, the man in the room, okay, was criticised for his violence. In room 2, the man in the room was praised for his violence. And in room 3, the man in the room received neither praise nor criticism. So the children were then placed in individual rooms with a Bobo doll and they were secretly observed, step C. So what was found? The children in room 1, where the man in the room was criticised for his violence, displayed the least aggression. Now, why was this experiment criticised? So many have argued it was very unnatural because it doesn't really prove very much. Okay, the unnatural nature of the experiment doesn't prove very much. And however, Bandura argued it does show the effects of media violence upon children. Okay, so important points. Many argue that in lab experiments it's impossible to completely control all variables. So when experiments are used in sociology, we tend to use field experiments. Okay, so we tend to use field experiments if we do use them because of this problem that lab experiments have. So let's look at field experiments now. So what are they? It's when you do research in the social world, hence it's called the field, like the sociological world, okay? So how are they conducted? So researchers, what they do is they decide a certain variable or they isolate a certain variable to test a particular hypothesis. So what are these experiments also called? They're also called natural experiments because of the fact that the researcher is covert, okay? But obviously we know that there are ethical concerns if the actors that are taking part in it are completely unaware of their participation. Okay, I'm gonna give you some examples with field experiments, so you will start to understand what I mean here. So let's look at a case study. So Sissons is a case study of a field experiment or a natural experiment, as it's also called. So what did Sissons do? Now, he used the same actor, and by actor here, I don't mean social actor, I mean a literal actor like you kind of get on TV, okay? A literal actor that acts. So what did the actor do? So firstly, he dressed in a suit and a bowler hat, so very smart. Okay, he dressed in a very smart fashion. Secondly, he dressed as a labourer, okay? So what did Sissons ask the actor to do? So the actor had to stand in Paddington Station, London, and he had to ask strangers for directions to Hyde Park. So the actor, this is really crucial, he had to use the same questions and words each time that he was asking for directions, whether he was dressed as 1 or 2. So he had to use the same questions and words each time he was asking for directions to Hyde Park. So what did Sissons find? So people responded much more positively and gave much more detailed directions when the actor was dressed in a very smart fashion. So what did Sissons conclude? The independent variable of social class was a big factor in how people responded. Okay, so the independent variable of social class was a big factor in terms of how those people responded when they gave directions. And social class, it was varied according to how the actor was dressed. Okay, so that's how it was operationalized. That's how, remember the word operationalized means how you define it, okay, or how you project it. So he projected social class by different dress. Okay, this is a third kind of experiment, and we very briefly need to know what it is about, okay, and it's called comparative research. So what is it? So it's also a kind of experiment, and it's been used by many sociologists, whether they are positivists or interpretivists. So Durkheim has used it, Weber has used it, okay, and we know Durkheim is a positivist and Weber is an interpretivist. So what does it involve? So you compare the effects of differences such as class, age, and ethnicity between people in society. So you compare the differences such as class, age, and ethnicity between people. So what can we find through comparing? So we can make correlations. So I've got an example for you here. So someone in a lower social class or lower social classes might suffer from more diseases. So there's a correlation between social class and diseases, for instance. Okay, so who prefers it more? Positivists, again, because it lets them test hypotheses. Okay, so they can then determine what are known as causal relationships. So A causes B to happen. Okay. So the background colours change, so we're going to look at advantages of experiments, which will be very useful for AO3. So these include, so first of all, experiments reflect the positivist belief that wherever we can, we should test under controlled conditions. Now, some organisations may well be able to do this kind of research if they've got the resources to control conditions and they can compare it with experimental conditions. Experiments are generally very reliable. That means they can be repeated time and time again. Field experiments generally have lesser ethical and practical problems, generally, but even they have ethical problems because obviously you've not, as we've touched on, you haven't provided your participants informed consent. Okay, now Popper argues that experiments help people collect empirical evidence, okay, and that helps us gain knowledge. Okay, empirical evidence is evidence which is based on proof. So, next advantage, so when the interaction between variables can be tested, so how the independent variable impacts the dependent, this can then help us show causal relationships, cause and effect. So these are just some advantages. Can you think of any others? If you can, jot them down. Okay, now let's look at disadvantages of experiments. So disadvantages, these include, they can trigger the Hawthorne effect, which can then impact validity, lab experiments in particular, because your participants or subjects know that they are being studied. Lab experiments can cause unnatural behaviour, and it's very impractical to create normal life in a lab and to control all the variables. Okay. Now, covert experiments lack informed consent and raise ethical concerns, especially as the BSA say that we must follow ethical guidelines. And can you think of any others? Okay. Now, please make sure you are completely up to date with all your notes and videos, and remember that revision is key. Thank you.